Most people pull into a gas station every week without thinking twice about it. Tap the card, fill the tank, watch the numbers climb, and never once ask a simple question. What if the fuel didn't have to come from there at all? Because there is a community in America that quietly answered that question a long time ago. They don't rely on gas stations the way you do. They don't panic when prices spike. They don't adjust their lives around fuel shortages. And it's not because they don't use engines. They do. Tractors, generators, equipment that runs every single day. The difference is not the machines, it's the source of the fuel. And once you understand what that source is, you start to see the entire system differently. Because this isn't about one alternative fuel, it's about a plant. One plant that produces two completely different types of fuel. One for diesel engines, one for gasoline engines. No redesign, no special hardware, no complicated conversion, just a different input. And the reason you haven't been taught this has nothing to do with whether it works. It has everything to do with what it replaces. Now here's what most people assume. If something like this existed, it would already be everywhere. That assumption is the mistake, because history is full of technologies that worked but didn't fit the system they threatened. And this is one of them. The plant is hemp, industrial hemp, not the version people argue about, not the one tied to headlines and controversy, a completely different category. Low THC, non-psychoactive, grown for fiber, seed, and oil. Legal to grow. But for most of the last century, treated as if it wasn't. Now, before you decide what that means, you need to understand what this plant actually does, because once you see the output, the reaction becomes predictable. Start with the seeds. Hemp seeds are dense with oil, roughly 30 to 35% by weight. That oil is not theoretical fuel, it's usable, extracted with pressure, the same way olive oil is pressed, the same way sunflower oil is made. No advanced chemistry required at this stage, just mechanical force. You press the seeds, and oil comes out. Now here's where most people expect complexity, because turning something into fuel usually sounds complicated. Refineries, cracking towers, industrial processes. But what happens next is surprisingly simple. The oil is converted through a process called transesterification. You combine it with methanol and a catalyst. The reaction separates it into two layers. One becomes biodiesel, the other becomes glycerin. You remove the glycerin, wash the remaining liquid, let it settle, and what you're left with is fuel. Not experimental fuel, not lab-only fuel. Fuel that meets the same standards as what comes from a pump. And here's the part that most people don't expect. That fuel can go directly into a diesel engine. No modification required, no adjustment needed. Because diesel engines were not originally designed for petroleum. They were designed for oil, plant oil. That was the original idea. When the diesel engine was introduced in the late 1800s, its inventor wasn't thinking about fossil fuels. He was thinking about agriculture, about farmers growing their own energy, about decentralizing fuel production. That was the concept. And for a brief period, that's exactly how it worked. Engines ran on vegetable oils, peanut oil, seed oils, crop-based fuels. The transition to petroleum came later, not because the original concept failed, but because something else became easier to scale. And once that happened, the entire system shifted. Now hold that thought, because the diesel side is only half of the equation. This plant doesn't just produce one fuel, it produces two. After the seeds are harvested and pressed, you're left with the rest of the plant. The stalk, fibrous, dense, rich in cellulose. Most people would consider that waste, but it's not, because cellulose can be broken down into sugars. Those sugars can be fermented, and fermentation produces ethanol, the same ethanol that is already blended into the gasoline you buy today. Every time you fill up, you're already using it, usually around 10%, sometimes more. The only difference is the source. Most ethanol comes from corn. This comes from hemp, which means one plant produces fuel for both types of engines, diesel and gasoline, from different parts of the same crop. Seeds for oil, stalks for ethanol. Nothing wasted. Now step back for a second, because this is where the pattern starts to emerge. One crop, two fuels, compatible with existing machines. No fundamental redesign required. If that sounds efficient, it is. If it sounds disruptive, it is. Because systems built around centralized production don't respond well to decentralized alternatives. And this is where history becomes important. Because none of this is new. This was known, understood, tested, and in some cases, implemented. There was a time when fuel didn't come exclusively from oil wells. It came from fields, from farms, from crops grown seasonally. And in parts of the country, it wasn't theoretical. It was operational. Stations sold plant-based fuel. Drivers used it. Engines ran on it. And then, within a very short period of time, it disappeared. Not gradually, not through slow decline, but quickly, within a few years. Infrastructure dismantled, production halted, public awareness erased, and replaced with a single dominant source: petroleum. Now here's where you need to be careful, because it's easy to jump to conclusions, to assume simple explanations. But the reality is more structured than that. Industries don't disappear because something is better. They disappear when something else becomes easier to standardize, distribute, and profit from. Petroleum had advantages: high energy density, established extraction methods, scalability across regions. But it also had something else: centralization, control. You can't centralize a crop in the same way you can centralize an oil field. You can't restrict production as easily. You can't regulate access in the same way. And that matters, because systems tend to favor what they can control. Now bring this back to the present, because this isn't just a historical detail. This is something that still exists, quietly, in specific communities. The Amish didn't adopt this because it was new. They adopted it because it was practical, local, understandable, repeatable. They grow crops, they process materials. They operate within systems that prioritize independence over convenience. So when a plant offers multiple outputs, fuel included, it fits into their framework naturally. They don't need a large supply chain. They don't need distribution networks. They don't need stations. They produce, they use, they repeat. Now here's the part most people miss. You don't need to replicate their entire lifestyle to understand the principle. You don't need acres of land. You don't need a full farm, because the concept scales, down as well as up. A small plot produces less, but it still produces. And when combined with the right systems, it changes how you think about energy entirely. Not as something you buy, but as something you can produce. And that shift is where the real impact is. Because once you see fuel as a product of land instead of a product of industry, the entire structure looks different. And that's exactly where this is going. Because understanding the plant is only the first step. The next step is understanding what happened when it started to matter. Why something this efficient, this adaptable, this compatible was removed from common use. And why almost nobody noticed when it happened. That's where the story actually begins. And it's not about the plant. It's about what it replaced. The shift didn't happen because people suddenly forgot how to grow hemp. It didn't happen because engines stopped working with plant-based fuel. And it definitely didn't happen because the physics changed. The chemistry stayed the same. The engine stayed the same. The plant stayed the same. What changed was the system around it. And to understand that, you have to look at a very specific window of time. Not a century, not decades, just a few years. Because that's all it took. There was a moment when plant-based fuel wasn't a theory. It was already in the market, operational, available, being sold to everyday drivers. Fuel stations across the American Midwest were offering blends that contained alcohol derived from crops. Thousands of people were using it. Engines ran fine, performance was stable, there was no technical failure forcing it out. But something else started happening at the same time. Pressure. Not mechanical pressure, not engineering limits. Economic pressure, policy pressure, market pressure. Because when two systems compete, the one that scales faster doesn't always win. The one that controls distribution usually does. Petroleum had already built infrastructure: extraction, refinement, transportation, retail, a complete pipeline. Plant-based fuels didn't have that. They relied on decentralized production. Farmers growing crops, regional processing, local distribution. And that model doesn't concentrate power in the same way. So when both systems existed side by side, one of them had an advantage that had nothing to do with performance. It had structure. Now here's where things get precise, because a lot of people treat this like a vague turning point. It wasn't vague, it was specific. Legislation changed how one plant was treated, and that plant was hemp. But it wasn't presented that way. It wasn't framed as an industrial crop. It wasn't discussed as a source of fiber, oil, or fuel. It was redefined under a different name, a name most people at the time didn't recognize. That shift in language matters, because once you disconnect a plant from its practical uses, you can regulate it without resistance from the people who depended on it. Farmers didn't realize at first what was happening, because the law didn't say hemp, it said something else. And by the time the connection became clear, the restrictions were already in place. Production dropped, processing stopped, supply chains dissolved. Not because the plant stopped working, but because growing it became complicated enough that most people simply stopped. Now look at the timing. Fuel infrastructure based on crops disappears. At the same time, the plant capable of producing those fuels becomes restricted. At the same time, petroleum expands into the space that's left behind. At the same time, that overlap is not random. It's structural. Because once a competing input is removed, the remaining system becomes dominant by default. Not because it's the only option, but because it's the only accessible one. And over time, accessible becomes normal. Normal becomes expected. Expected becomes unquestioned. That's how systems stabilize, not by eliminating alternatives completely, but by making them invisible. Now fast forward. Decades pass. Generations grow up without ever seeing fuel produced from crops. Engines are assumed to require petroleum. Gas stations become part of daily life. And the idea that fuel could come from a field starts to sound unrealistic, even though it worked before, even though it still works, even though the chemistry never changed. This is where perception replaces reality. Because most people don't evaluate systems based on what's possible, they evaluate them based on what's available. And if something isn't available, it's treated as if it doesn't exist. That's exactly what happened here. Now bring this back to the present. Because the restriction didn't last forever, the legal framework changed again, quietly, without the same level of attention. Hemp became legal to grow once more, not in theory, in practice, across large parts of the country. And when that happened, something interesting occurred. The knowledge didn't need to be rediscovered. It was already there, documented, tested, proven. Universities had data. Engine manufacturers had historical records. Agricultural systems already understood the crop. The only thing that had been missing was permission. Now here's where people expect a massive shift, a return to widespread adoption, fuel stations switching inputs, large-scale change. That didn't happen, and the reason is simple. Rebuilding an alternative system is harder than maintaining an existing one, even if the alternative works, even if it's efficient, even if it's accessible. Because infrastructure doesn't reset automatically. It persists. Pipelines don't disappear. Refineries don't shut down. Distribution networks don't dissolve. Once a system reaches scale, it tends to stay there, unless something forces it out. And nothing forced petroleum out. So the reintroduction of hemp didn't replace anything. It just reopened a door that most people didn't notice, because they weren't looking for it. Now think about what that means. The plant is available, the processes are known, the engines are compatible, but the system hasn't shifted, which creates a gap between what's possible and what's common. And that gap is where individuals start experimenting again. Small-scale production, local systems, personal fuel independence, not at the level of national infrastructure, but at the level of a household, a property, a piece of land. And that's where the Amish model becomes relevant again. Because they never depended on the centralized system to begin with. They didn't need to transition back. They never left. They simply continued using what worked. Quietly, consistently, without needing validation from the broader market. And that's the part most people overlook. This isn't about replacing gas stations overnight. It's about understanding that they're not the only option. They're the dominant option. But dominance doesn't equal necessity. It just reflects the system that was built. Now here's the question that matters. If you had access to a fuel source you could grow, process, and use without relying on external supply chains, what would that change? Not in theory, in practice. Would you still treat fuel the same way? Would you still see it as something you have to buy, or something you could produce? because once that perspective shifts, everything built around it starts to look different. And that brings us to the final piece, because knowing the history explains how it disappeared. Knowing the process explains how it works, but neither of those answers the most important question. How do you actually use it? Not at the level of theory, at the level of a real property, a real setup, a real system that runs day after day. That's where this stops being information and starts becoming application. And that's what we're breaking down next. Now we get to the part most people care about. Not the history, not the politics, not the theory. What does this actually look like in the real world? Because if something only works on paper, it doesn't matter. But this doesn't stay on paper. It scales down to something practical. Start simple. If you have a diesel engine, that's your entry point. A generator, a small tractor, a water pump, anything that runs on diesel can run on biodiesel. The process doesn't require a refinery. At small scale, it's contained. A press for extracting oil, a basic reactor for conversion, a separation and wash stage. That's it. People build these systems using repurposed equipment, old water heaters, simple tanks, basic plumbing. You're not manufacturing fuel at industrial scale. You're producing enough for your own use. And that distinction matters, because once you stop thinking in terms of mass production, the barrier drops. Now look at the gasoline side. Ethanol production is more involved, but still accessible. Fermentation tank, distillation setup, proper permits depending on where you are. The process has been understood for centuries. You're converting plant material into alcohol, then blending it into fuel. At low percentages, most engines don't even notice the difference, because they're already designed to handle it. That's the key point. You're not reinventing engines, you're changing inputs. Now here's where most people hesitate. They assume scale is the problem, that you'd need acres of land to make it worthwhile. But the math doesn't work that way. Even small production offsets consumption. You don't need to replace 100% of your fuel overnight. Reducing dependency is enough to change the equation, because every unit you produce is one you don't have to buy. And that's where the shift happens. Not in total independence, but in partial control. Now bring it back to the bigger picture. Gas stations still exist. Oil still dominates. The system hasn't collapsed, but it's no longer the only option. And once an alternative exists, even at small scale, the relationship changes. You stop being fully dependent. You start having leverage. That's what this plant actually represents. Not just fuel, choice. The ability to produce something essential instead of sourcing it entirely from outside. And that's why it never fully disappeared. Because once something works at that level, it doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs someone willing to use it. So here's the question. If you had access to a system like this, what would you power first? Your generator? Your vehicle? Your entire setup? Drop it in the comments, because what you choose says a lot about how you think about energy. And if this changed how you see it, then you're already looking at the system differently. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.